After the Tashkent bombings in 1999, Muhammad Ali Makhmudov was incessantly tortured by beating, suffocation, and even by sticking needles under his fingernails. All this was done just to force a confession out of him that he was involved in the Tashkent bombings. After all of this, he was taken to court and sentenced to prison. You may have thought that torture like this has now become a thing of the past, but unfortunately, torture like this is still very prevalent in Uzbekistan. Each torture method is more gruesome than the last. Victims are still beaten, raped, and exposed to harsh conditions in order to force confessions out of them, or punish them for misdemeanors. Many people suffer each year of torture that they do not even deserve, or that exceeds the gravity of the crime they committed. Nobody likes pain. It's an inhumane device to extract anything from anyone. Torture does just this. It inflicts pain. This is to force a false confession out of someone who seems like a reasonable suspect, just to provide the government with a pseudo person who stands in place of the real convict. Even if the people are real convicts, they're still treated really unfairly and they're subjected to inhuman forms of torture. Rape, sexual humiliation, and beatings are just a few examples of the brutality and severity of torture going on in Uzbekistan. Because the government, backed by President Islam Karimov, wholeheartedly supports torture, other countries and the UN view Uzbekistan as a torture house and a country that's suffering, devoid of human rights, and that needs assistance immediately. Uzbekistan's rich history is erased and destroyed by its superficial wrongdoings. If torture was completely erased, people would have much more freedoms. They'd be allowed to speak up, share their opinions about how to make the country a better place. Right now, freedom, especially freedom of the press, is null, as anyone who speaks against the government is severely punished or exterminated. Historically, many gruesome crimes have been committed throughout the history of Uzbekistan. A man named Dilshud Shavadov was handcuffed and forced to stay in his cell naked for several days. His body, back, arms, and legs had marks of torture and handcuffs. When Shavadov went on a hunger strike to protest against all the torture, he was force-fed by the guards, thus injuring his mouth severely. Other cases even include boiling people alive. In 2008, the government tried to introduce habeas corpus, although this was more of an attempt to throw other countries off their trail rather than to put an end to torture. Considering this, it may seem that putting an end to torture in Uzbekistan is impossible, but there are some things that can potentially help to alleviate the crisis. In general, many voices are heard over one, so it may make sense that if the population of Uzbekistan protested against torture, it'll have much more of a significant impact than if only a couple people protested. A couple of people are easily subdued, but a large crowd of people are not easily controlled. Thus, if a large populace protests against torture, the government just may have to give in to them. Rather than one person, many people should take action against torture crimes. They should also investigate them, document them, and prosecute them. By doing these, people will fear to torture others, for if they do, their case will be thoroughly investigated, documented, and prosecuted. If the people of Uzbekistan unite together, not only will torture be overthrown, but they'll also have much more power in their hands. And they can use that to elect a much better president rather than the one they have now. However, this may be really hard to do considering how government has reacted to previous protests. In 2005, the city of Andijan protested against a 23-year-old businessman accused of Islam extremism. In response to this, President Islam Karimov sent armed troops to stop the non-violent protests, and they fired randomly into the crowd. They killed a lot of women, men, and children. With such little tolerance for anything against the government, it'll be hard for the population of Uzbekistan to unite and protest against torture crimes. If people living in Uzbekistan are willing to take risks and try to protest against torture in Uzbekistan, they have a hope of abolishing it. Also, the current president, Islam Karimov, is aging rapidly. He's already in his late 70s, and he will probably soon step out of office. If he goes out, a new regime will take his place, and this may issue a new era for Uzbekistan. A new era where there is no torture, there's hope and freedom for the citizens, where they're allowed to build a structured society where they can all contribute, share their opinions, have the rights that they deserve, etc. But for now, the people must do everything they can to protest against torture, and this has to begin by documenting some torture cases. This is being already done by some organizations such as Amnesty International, but in the end, it's the people of Uzbekistan who have to take the action. They have to be the ones who protest against the torture, who say no to the torture. With the prospect of a new government in the future, and if people take action against torture now, then there's a hope that in the coming years, torture will be finally eliminated in Uzbekistan.